Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.
Good evening. President Reagan recently made a major economic decision, a decision likely to affect your pocketbook for a long time to come. Yet it was a decision for the most part that was given very little notice in this part of the country. The president's decision was to reject a call for import restrictions on foreign steel into the United States. But instead of imposing official quotas on imported steel, Mr. Reagan wants to negotiate voluntary restrictions with many countries who have over the last year accounted for over 20% of all of the steel bought and sold in the United States. The White House has presented this voluntary program of restrictions aimed at reducing imports to 18.5% as in upholding the administration's free trade principles. Others, however, see the effect as imposing quotas without calling them quotas. So why is all of this important to you? Well, for starters, as the New York Times pointed out in an editorial, any tampering with the free flow and pricing of steel will push up the cost of everything, as the newspaper put it, from Thunderbirds to Budweisers. One estimate says Mr. Reagan's voluntary import restrictions will cause Americans to pay as much as $3 billion a year, more for things that are produced with steel. Farmers have been worried about a move to restrict steel imports as well, fearing that the exporting countries will retaliate by refusing to buy as many American farm products. And the steel industry and steel workers, of course, have been worried too. The Steelworkers Union says 200,000 jobs have been lost in the industry, and that allowing so much foreign steel into this country puts even more jobs at risk. So tonight, with two economists, a union official, and a former State Department official who's worked extensively on economic issues, we'll try to sort out some of the messages contained in the President's big decision about steel and how they might affect you. Our first view tonight comes from Dr. William Allen. He's a professor of economics at UCLA. He has a popular radio commentary on economic issues, and in addition is president of the International Institute of Economic Research. Dr. Allen, does this decision, in your view, make economic sense?
Oh, about as much as most economic policy decisions make, which is not a great deal. I think to understand that sort of thing, you turn not really to good, substantial, well-established economic analysis. You turn to politics, and you consult the specialist in abnormal psychology.
So it wasn't a good policy decision.
Well, I was brought up by a wise man to believe that in this world of scarcity and misery, typically the best you can do is to minimize losses, not to maximize profit. And as a loss minimization decision, it may make very good sense. I don't think there's any great mystery, speaking as an outsider to be sure, as to why the decision was made. The idea was to come as close as the President and his advisors thought feasible to what they really did want without alienating an excessive number of people in the community.
In other words, quotas without calling them quotas, or some sort of restrictions without...
Well, certainly restrictions. There can be no question of that. We might quibble over whether or not it is a quota, but I think probably we ought to say it's quotas by the back door.
And what's wrong with that, fundamentally?
Well, what's wrong in a word is inefficiency. The market, when permitted to perform, does wondrous things. The market is an institutional device and process and mechanism and procedure through which the community indicates its preferences and registers costs. No one is in charge in the sense of an economic czar, but the collection of information on both demands and costs lead people in their own private grubby ways, in their own self-interested manner, to use resources in the best way possible. And whenever you have restrictions, subsidies, penalties, you have a distortion. You short-circuit the market mechanism. And this particular case could have been worse. It is not disastrous, After all, the world has had much greater disasters and will have more in the future. But it is in the wrong direction.
Okay. Would you agree with the assessment that I mentioned a moment ago that it's likely to cost the average consumer a substantial amount?
Well, evidently, I do not have hard numbers which I have tried to play with. I did see an editorial in a financial newspaper yesterday saying that the steel prices might rise some 6 or 7% as a result of this. Now, whether it's 6 or 7 or 5 or 8, no one this side of heaven can now be sure.
And that impacts everything from automobiles to refrigerators?
It doesn't help, certainly, so far as that criterion goes. Now, there are other considerations, but one consideration is what happens to the price of steel. And yes, of course, it will go up.
Let me ask you finally, the White House has attempted, since this decision was announced, to couch it in free trade terms, saying that the President has always believed in free trade, and this is basically, fundamentally, an issue of keeping trade barriers as low as possible. Is it that?
Oh, I try to be tolerant, really, truly, of people who bear the responsibility of making public decisions. It's easy for the academic economist to draw himself up nobly and say, if I were in that position, I would call them as I see them, and I see them right, and so I would call them right. In fact, it has to be very difficult. It has to be difficult as evidenced by the fact that this president and all of his predecessors, and doubtless all who will come, do not, in fact, consistently call them right. There is no legitimate way that this decision can be classed as a free trade policy. That's manifestly absurd. But you call it that way in the hope of convincing some voters who may be sympathetic, while at the same time offering some protection for those who want the protection. So you try to minimize the losses, we say again.
We'll come back, sir. Thank you. Democratic presidential candidate Walter Mondale has advocated direct quotas on imported steel, quotas that he says would limit imports to about 17% of the U.S. market. Mondale has generally supported the position of organized labor on this issue, even though he has spoken directly in the past in favor of free trade. For another view of all of this now, we turn to a union official. Jim Kearns is the president of the Idaho AFL-CIO. Mr. Kearns, as I understand it, your view would be that the president's decision just didn't go far enough.
Well, I think the president and this administration they don't have an industrial policy. There is no fair trade and there's no free trade in this world right now. We operate on one set of rules, the rest of the world operates on another. The steel decision is going to cost jobs. Our trade deficit will probably go up more. And for every $1 billion of our trade deficit that goes up, the Department of Commerce says we're going to lose 25,000 additional jobs in this country. We must, by using our muscle, by using whatever means that's necessary, develop an international trade policy along with the rest of the world, where we don't continue to compete on a basis that's not fair or equitable. We're letting other countries, Japan, West Germany, Brazil, Korea, all of them, set our trade policy by their tariff barriers or their barriers that they've put up in their own countries. And they have many. You talk about protectionism, those countries and most foreign countries that we deal with the possible exception of Canada, have very, very restrictive barriers, protectionism from their own industries. We don't. We open our markets as wide as business will allow them or want them to be opened up. And the way our strong dollar is right now, the way the economy is, we're taking the beating. The workers and businesses in this country are taking a terrific beating.
Now, the president, of course, says he can have his special trade representative, Ambassador Brock, sit down with representatives of these countries, Brazil, South Korea, a couple of the biggest importers of steel into this country, and negotiate directly across the table and say, we can arrive at an agreement where you will voluntarily limit your imports, much as the way the Japanese have limited imports of automobiles. Can't that work?
We have agreements now that says that it's illegal to dump steel in this country, and we have restrictions that we can place on it. We pointed out, I'll say labor and the steel industry pointed out to the president that certain countries were dumping steel and depressing the market, and they did it anyway. Unless we're prepared to develop an industrial or an international trade policy with these other countries and follow through. Gentlemen's agreements aren't going to work. The general, I think it's called the General Agreement on Tariffs and what's the other word? Trade. Basically is a handshake type operation.
And your view is that those just don't work for you?
They don't work.
Okay. I know you have a very different view of the economic ramifications than we've just heard from Dr. Allen. He says that this would be an inefficient decision in directly tampering with the marketplace, even though you don't call them quotas. What's your view of that?
Well, again, I don't want to repeat myself, but the free marketplace, or the, quote, unfettered free enterprise system, does not work in international trade. If everyone operated the way that our country operates, then we could compete much more efficiently on an international trade basis than we do now. We can't trade that way now. We're going to take a beating. Our strong dollar right now costs us 60%. On goods that we would try to put into another country. Automatically the prices go up 60% because of our strong dollar. Again, it just, this president and
one set of rules for them and a different set of rules.
That's right.
Okay.
And there's no trade.
Let me just ask you finally one quick thing. This decision was made, according to some of the analysis I've read, in part because there was a great concern in the agricultural community that farmers would suffer if some direct restrictions were placed on imports. Was this a trade-off, basically, farmers against steel workers?
I think it was a very political decision that was made. It was interesting, the day that we're going to have a handshake on steel imports. We also had a trade agreement written up on what kind of subsidies we're going to give the farms. And it's interesting that and God bless them for getting it, because at least we're getting on somewhat of an equal basis in the agriculture industry on what the rest of the international world does. But we're giving some subsidies on R&D. We're giving some long-term interest loans or interest-free loans for farmers to be able to compete. We've been losing our share of the agriculture international trade since 1980, from like $10 billion surplus now down to $4.5 billion, and this at least is going to help the farmer stay competitive on an international market. He kicked steel in the rear and helped a farmer. The gentleman next to me said that he wanted to alienate the smaller number. He picked steel as the smaller number, and he's right, because we're out of work.
We'll come back, sir. Thank you. A look now at how this decision might affect the American farmer, particularly the Idaho farmer. That view comes from Dr. Jim Jones, an agricultural economist at the University of Idaho in Moscow. He teaches courses dealing with international farm trade, and Dr. Jones joins us tonight in Moscow. What about Mr. Kearns' last comment there, that basically this was, in a way, a political trade-off, giving the farmers something while not giving the steel workers something?
Well, I would agree that it was political, as the other two commentators. I don't really see how we can say that the farmer gets very much out of this particular action by the administration. Agriculture in the United States is one of those sectors that has to depend on exports. We all know that. And protectionism and this voluntary restraints is the same horse with a different mouth, as one of my colleagues said earlier to me today, as quotas, or even in a sense tariffs. And any restrictive policy like this is inimical to the interest of the agricultural community that depends so heavily upon exports.
How so?
Well, obviously, protectionism eventually comes back to haunt you. It haunts the consumer, first off. While I'm supposed to talk about the farmer's perspective, we can't forget that ultimately it's the consumer that we're all concerned about. Farmers are consumers too. And it haunts them in that they pay higher prices. But from the point of view of the farmer, the agricultural sector is primarily an export sector. And protectionism is a beggar thy neighbor type action that eventually comes back with restrictions on the other side that hurts our markets. We saw immediately the effect of the textile policies of this administration on our sales to the Chinese. This was very direct, and maybe in a way the Chinese did us a favor by at least making it blatant to us that there is two sides of this kind of picture.
Yeah, the administration, maybe just interject that the administration placed imports on Chinese, or restrictions on Chinese textiles, and the Chinese retaliated immediately by saying, well, we're not going to buy what it amounted to $500 million worth of farm exports or something. Direct
Yes.
retaliation for our action. And that's what farmers were worried about in this case, right?
Right.
Okay.
And in another perspective, when we talk about trade, our buyers, our customers, to buy from us, they have to sell to us, and ultimately restriction reduces countries such as Brazil, who apparently will be impacted by this action that the administration has taken. It reduces their purchasing power, which is one of the reasons that we are having difficulty, of course, today selling in the first place. Now, finally, when we talk about higher steel, in this case, I said earlier, the farmer is a consumer. In this case, the farmer is a consumer of inputs, and tractors and combines and so forth. And so the higher price associated with the steel inputs, that will in turn be passed on to the farmer by the farm implement industry is another consideration. So I don't see in any way that you could say that this policy, it is restrictionist, and it certainly is not something that aids the agricultural sector at large.
Okay, Dr. Jones, we'll come back in a moment. Thank you very much. For a look finally at how well these voluntary restrictions can work to limit imports, we turn to Dr. Amos Yoder. For 25 years, a State Department official serving in many foreign and domestic posts and specializing in economic affairs. Dr. Yoder is now a distinguished professor of political science at the University of Idaho, where he joins us tonight. You heard Mr. Kern say, Dr. Yoder, that he didn't think these gentlemen's agreements like the President has proposed really worked very well. What's your view of that?
Well, I think he also says it's a matter of least of several evils. This is a very political matter, as the speakers have indicated, and the purpose of the negotiating these quotas with foreign countries, voluntary quotas with foreign countries, is to keep it from going into a tariff. A tariff, if Congress gets cranked up on a tariff, it takes them a year or so to have the hearings and pass the tariff, and then it gets set into concrete, and it's awfully hard to change. Quotas are one step down from tariffs. They're hard to change. But these voluntary quotas that we negotiate with foreign countries, this puts the political power into the hands of the President and his advisor, Mr. Brock, and so forth. And they can bargain and deal with these individual countries. And they've been doing this for, I think, around 25 years. The textiles is the best known that you've mentioned. They've done this for the past 25 years. They've negotiated these types of voluntary agreements, and surprisingly enough, it's easier to negotiate textile agreements on jeans or T-shirts and shirts and so forth, and to do this year after year, then, or at least the administration thinks so, and I think with some justification, than it is to put this whole process into a tariff or a formal quota procedure.
So you're saying, in effect, they do work pretty well?
Well, they do work, but they're restriction. They're hard on the consumers, and as all economists will say, or most economists will say, eventually their quotas act to the disadvantage of everyone concerned, whether you're selling or buying.
The Reagan administration, as I mentioned earlier, has tried to paint this as a free trade issue. Let me ask you if, in your view, this administration really has a coherent trade policy, or does any administration really develop such a thing?
I think your last statement is close to the truth. I don't think any, just by the nature of the beast, it's hard to have a coherent trade policy. It's sort of a matter of putting Band-Aids here and there and trying to keep a protectionist swell from raising. Now, this particular act is thought to perhaps cut back steel imports as much as 20–25%. And the textile quotas from year to year generally don't roll it back, they just keep it from increasing. So this is a protectionist type of a voluntary quota that Mr. Brock intends to negotiate, more so than many of the other quotas that have been put into effect.
In fact, I read someone's analysis saying that it might be the most protectionist decision that this administration has made.
Well, yes, I think that's probably correct. They put off a similar, or they have been putting off a similar thrust by the copper industry, but this one, it is protectionist.
Let me just ask you finally, Dr. Yoder, in your experience in the State Department, I read another analysis of this decision which said basically that the only free traders in any administration are sort of the middle-level managers in the State Department and the Commerce Department who have the luxury of looking at these things without taking into account the domestic political concerns. Fair statement?
It's not quite accurate. The Wall Street Journal reports that 6 of the 8 president's advisors were against this step, but he took it anyway. There were congressmen in to see him, and a hearing was held in which the results were that we should protect the steel industry more. So you also get some free traders at the top level, but at that level they're also realists, and they realize this is a political process and one of bargaining and dealing with the various interests concerned.
Okay. Well, let me open this up and invite all of you to get back in whenever you want, but let me go first back to Dr. Allen. Does this administration have any coherent trade policy that you've been able to ascertain?
Oh, I suppose that depends on both the adjective and the noun, what you mean by coherent and what you mean by policy. Our president, like most who have been in that position, talks a very good game. Few play a game which is any place near as good as what they talk. So one can talk about ideals and objectives and general criteria, and so far as I know, the president believes that. I think he probably doesn't understand it very well, but he knows what he likes even if he can't explain it. But when it comes down to the nitty-gritty of trying to patch the world up and get along and make do for another month or another year, well, then we do indeed have our patches here and there, and that gives an impression of lack of coherency. But let me add this. I would suggest that while we would like the world to be more receptive to good economic principle, to be more enthusiastic for allocating resources through the dictates of market calculations, that it isn't necessarily wise that just because the rest of the world engages in mercantilistic foolishness, that we ought to join them.
Well, I guess that's almost a direct response to what Mr. Kearns was saying earlier about us having one set of rules by which we play and the rest of the world having a different set of rules.
That's right, but do you acquiesce? Do you capitulate in their foolishness, or do you try to exert pressure to make the world better?
Well, let me interrupt and ask Mr. Kearns to comment on that.
We've got to do one or the other. I think, my own opinion, and I don't think this is the opinion of the National AFL-CIO, but direct government intervention in steel, we're talking about steel here, is that there are governments out there that are subsidizing their industries at a loss so they can penetrate our marketplace and basically destroy jobs, destroy an industry. I don't know if they're going to do that on purpose, but they know, when I'm talking about them, West Germany, Japan, and the other producers know that the United States is not going to take any firm action against them doing this. They've done it in the past, they're not going to do it again. We've got to come to some sort of an agreement on trade, and I think agriculture is our hammer. We're the food basket of the world in the North American continent.
Let me ask the agricultural economist about that. Dr. Jones in Moscow, can we use the agricultural hammer to make the other countries play fair?
Well, I don't think that that hammer is going to have much impact with this kind of policy. I'd like to come back to this thing of fair trade and how the world works. And it's true, of course, that there is a lot of restrictionism out there, and that other actors don't play fair or by the rules that we would like to. So consequently, there is this constant political process of can we somehow hammer down these restrictions? Now, the thing that disturbs me about this, it's true that, say, if we go into negotiations with others, that if we're going to try to get them to open their markets, we sometimes do that by trading, or usually end up doing that by trading off and removing some of our barriers. And that is the reality of negotiation. The problem is that what we're talking about now is not that kind of a device. We're talking about instituting a new protectionist device. And we already have plenty of protectionist devices to trade off. And in a sense, what we're doing here is a little bit analogous to contracting a disease to enjoy the cure. So I don't think we need more restrictions that we can go out and try to trade off with the common market in Japan.
Mr. Kearns?
Well, we've got the problem. I'm probably the only non-economist here. Yeah, now I'm boasting is right. I guess I'm just hopefully one of the people's off the street, and we know that we're in trouble. We know that we've got a trade deficit that is really hurting this country. We know that other countries operate at different rules. We've got to find a common ground. Lawrence McQuaid of W.R. Gray says that Russia and Mexico are depressing natural gas prices, which they're feeder stock for ammonia, and they're selling it at below market price, and it's, quote, depressing U.S. ammonia prices. And we're not talking about ammonia prices to the consumer, as I am a consumer, but as a consumer as it is to industry, and our companies that build fertilizers and this sort of thing are not able to compete on the international market because of these subsidies. Now, we've got an agricultural agreement with Russia. I think it's the only bilateral agreement that we have with Russia with trade. Some avenue has to be raised to get everyone to play at the same rules.
Okay, let me go
Mark?
finally. Yes, sir.
Mark, I think in this process, it's just the nature of the thing that the consumer always gets short shrift. The people with jobs to lose are the ones that can exert the most political pressure and get the most sympathy. But the consumer who pays for it across the board with higher prices for automobiles, higher prices for shirts, higher prices for machinery and so forth gets hit. And the other thing, particularly from the point of view of Idaho, is that we export about 2/3 of our wheat here. And if we don't buy things from other countries, they can't buy from us. It's that simple. And in order to get dollars, we have to buy things from them. And so by cutting down on imports, it's making it harder and causing our farmers to lose money.
Let me just ask you, Dr. Yoder, finally in about 15 seconds, do we have these, are we going through a cycle of worldwide protectionism right now? Is it a cyclical thing that changes from time to time?
I think it is somewhat cyclical. When you have unemployment and when you are coming out of a recession, there is a tendency to be more protectionist. But these voluntary agreements have been in place for 25 years,
right.
At least some of them.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt you there. Dr. Yoder and Dr. Smith, or Dr. Jones, I'm sorry, in Moscow, thank you, gentlemen, for joining us tonight. We appreciate it very much. Mr. Kearns and Dr. Allen, thank you, gentlemen.